All right, we're ready to begin our next presentation, which will be an overview of food labeling requirements by Ms. Felicia Billingslea. Felicia?
Thank you, Shirley. Good morning. As Shirley mentioned, my name is Felicia Billingslea, and I am the Director of the Food Labeling and Standard Staff in the Office of Nutrition, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements. Over the next few minutes, I will be talking to you about general food labeling requirements, including ingredient labeling for foods governed by the FDA. I will also briefly discuss the food standards of identity that FDA has established. To help set the stage for our regulations, one must first understand the purpose of food labeling. Labeling is designed to inform the consumer at the point of purchase about the basic nature of the food. For example, is it bread, cheese, or milk? The label informs what ingredients were used to make the product, what the nutritional attributes of the food are, and any other essential information so that the consumer can appropriately and safely use the product. All labeling on a food package falls into two categories. It is either mandatory or voluntary. All of the mandatory pieces of information must appear on nearly all foods under FDA's jurisdiction that are in package form. These mandatory label elements are required by either the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, the Public Health Service Act, or FDA's regulations. Mandatory labeling is not intended to provide exhaustive information, but all necessary information that the consumer needs to know about the product and how to safely use the product, if not otherwise evident. We will discuss the last concept more fully a bit later. You may see other mandatory information on a label that is required by other federal or state government agencies. For example, country of origin labeling is required by both the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agriculture Marketing Service. Information on the label that is not mandatory is described as voluntary information and is used at the manufacturer's discretion. Voluntary labeling must be truthful and not misleading, or the product will be considered misbranded and can be subject to enforcement action. In addition, there are some terms that can be used voluntarily on the label, but only if the food meets certain requirements. You will hear more about these types of claims later today from one of my colleagues. So, what are the mandatory elements? For conventional foods as well as dietary supplements, the mandatory elements are the identity of the food, what we refer to as the statement of identity, the ingredient statement, the amount of food in the package expressed as the net quantity of contents, the name and place of business of the firm responsible for the manufacture, packing, or distribution of the food, the nutrition information unless the food is exempt. Foods that are produced by small, low-volume firms may be exempt from nutrition labeling. Allergen information for the 8 most common allergens. Dr. Gendel will talk more about the allergen labeling requirements this afternoon, and any other essential or material information. FDA's regulations require that these mandatory label elements appear on the label in English, and that if any of the mandatory label elements appear on the label in a foreign language, then all other required statements must appear in that foreign language as well as in English. There is one exception, and that is for products that are intended to be sold only in Puerto Rico. Such products can bear all required labeling in Spanish only. However, if any English labeling is also provided, all required label elements must be in both English and Spanish. FDA regulations also outline the principles associated with the naming of foods. Generally speaking, the statement of identity, also referred to as the name of the food, must be one of the principal features on the principal display panel. It must appear in bold type, and it should be at least 1/2 the type size of the largest print on the label. The statement of identity can be either a name specified in one of FDA's governing laws or regulations. For example, butter is actually established in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act versus whole wheat bread, which has a standard of identity and is specified by regulation. Or the statement of identity can be the common or usual name of the food product. For example, baked corn snack. Finally, a statement of identity can be a descriptive name that is not misleading. For example, corn, broccoli, and carrots blend. The next mandatory element is the ingredient label. All ingredients used to make a food must be listed in the ingredient statement. This includes ingredients that themselves have sub-ingredients. For example, cheddar cheese has sub-ingredients. So if the product is macaroni and cheese, both of the primary ingredients may have sub-ingredients, and these sub-ingredients would have to be declared in parentheses following the name of the ingredient. Some ingredients and their concentrates may be declared by collective terms. For example, milk, concentrated milk, reconstituted milk, and dry whole milk may be declared in the ingredient statement as simply milk. Ingredients are required to be listed in descending order of predominance, and that refers to the amount of the ingredient that was used to make the food. The ingredient list should be placed on the information panel if there is one, or on the same panel as the manufacturer's statement. As noted in the previous slide, the ingredient should be declared by its common name, and the ingredient list can be no smaller than 1/16 of an inch. FDA's regulations do allow more flexible labeling for ingredients that are present at 2% or less. These types of ingredients may include flavorings or preservatives. Ingredients that are present at 2% or less need not adhere to the descending order of predominance requirement if the ingredients are preceded by a qualifying statement, such as contains 2% or less of blank, with the blank filled in with the names of the ingredients. Let's see what you remember to this point. Ingredients are declared in descending order of predominance based on the amount of the ingredient that is in the finished food. Is that true or false? We will give you a couple of seconds to answer, and I'll come back to the question. There are some additional exceptions to the ingredient labeling requirements. Single ingredient foods, such as a bag of carrots, are not required to have an ingredient statement. And incidental additives that meet the requirements noted on this slide are not required to be declared in the ingredient statement. One thing in particular that I should point out is that to be considered an incidental additive, the ingredient has to be non-functional in the finished food and present at an insignificant level. Some examples of the incidences where labeling is not required would be ingredients of ingredients, where one of those is a free-flowing agent used on a cheese product that is used to make macaroni and cheese or pizza. Processing aids, where an anti-caking agent is used but is no longer functioning in the finished food. Substances migrating to food from equipment or packaging, for example, cornstarch used on a conveyor belt. And keep in mind, in each of these cases, the ingredient cannot be a major food allergen. Finally, sulfites that are present at less than 10 parts per million and are not added directly to the finished food may also be exempt from ingredient labeling. Well, I see 94% of you have responded, and it looks like about 8 of you got the answer correct. The question, ingredients are declared in descending order of predominance based on the amount of the ingredient that is in the finished food. The answer is false. Ingredients are declared in descending order of predominance based on the amount of the ingredient that was used to make the product. Some ingredients may be used up in the process or may be cooked off to some extent, but they were used in making the product. Therefore, the list reflects what was used in the formulation or recipe of the food. The next mandatory element is the net quantity of content statement, also referred to as the net weight statement. The net weight statement must be a prominent feature of the principal display panel and should not have to compete with vignettes or other graphics. The net quantity of content statement describes the amount of food in the package. This statement is placed on the lower 30% of the PDP, is conspicuous, and must be parallel to the base of the package. The declaration is in metric and U.S. customary units, that is inch-pound measurements. And the area of the PDP determines the type size, but in no case can the net weight statement be less than 1/16 of an inch. FDA regulations also require that the name and place of business of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor appear on the food label. This information may also include a post office box and an email address, but both are voluntary and do not satisfy the mandatory requirement. The street address is mandatory unless the business name appears in the current telephone directory for that city and state. This requirement allows the consumer to get in touch with the manufacturer if they have questions about a product. The principal place of business may appear on the label if the food is manufactured at a site other than the principal place of business. If the food is not manufactured by the company whose name appears on the label, terms such as manufactured for, distributed by, or imported by may be used. The absence of one of these terms means that the firm listed is the actual manufacturer or the parent company of the manufacturer. In the case of imported items, the domestic company responsible for distributing the product may be the name identified on the package, or the name and address of the importing company may be the one listed. In either of these cases, the relationship to the manufacturer must also be included. Okay, let's have our second quiz. What are the FDA's basic mandatory labeling elements that must be on packaged food? Again, I'll give you a few minutes to look the question over, and we'll come back and discuss that. The last mandatory element that I will discuss falls under the general type of information that is essential or material. Under Section 201N of the FD&C Act, a food is misbranded if the product label fails to reveal information about consequences that may result from the use of a product under customary or usual conditions of use. I'd like to particularly draw your attention to the highlighted text on this slide. FDA does not have the authority to require manufacturers to put information on the label simply because the consumer wants to know. This is where the absence of information is material information and thus required on the food label are those that pose special health or environmental risks. For example, shell eggs are required to bear safe handling instructions, advising consumers that to ensure safe use of the food, there are certain steps that they should take. Another example is information required on products containing psyllium husks. Due to a potential choking hazard, the product containing psyllium husks advises that it should be eaten with at least a full glass of liquid and that people with difficulty swallowing should not consume the product. Other case where information is required is when the absence of the information can mislead the consumer in light of other statements made on the label, or when the absence of information or the presentation of the product causes the consumer to assume that the food is similar to another food when it is not. An example here would be low or reduced fat margarine that cannot be used in frying. So let's see how well we did on this quiz. What are the FDA's basic mandatory labeling elements that must be on packaged food? The correct answer is C, and 93% of you got that correct. Congratulations. The name of the food, amount of the food in the package, ingredient list, name and place of business of the manufacturer, and the nutrition facts label. Expiration date and UPC codes are not required by FDA. There are two places on packaged food where mandatory information must appear. It must either be on the principal display panel or the information panel. A food package may have only a principal display panel. In such cases, all of the required information must appear on the PDP. However, when the food package has both a PDP and an information panel, then the statement of identity or the name of the food and the net quantity of contents must appear on the PDP. The other information is required on the information panel. The principal display panel is the portion of the package that is most likely to be seen by the consumer. Some packages are designed with two or more different surfaces that are suitable for display as the principal display panel. This is as seen by the consumer when the consumer is facing the product. The information panel is defined by regulation as the panel immediately contiguous and to the right of the principal display panel as observed by an individual facing the principal display panel. Except that if this panel is unusable, then the next right panel is the information panel. If there is more than one PDP, then the panel immediately contiguous and to the right of any principal display panel may be used. If the top of the container is the principal display panel and there is no alternate principal display panel, then any panel adjacent may be used. When there is an information panel, it must contain the ingredient statement and the name and address of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor. The nutrition facts label can also be on the information panel, but the nutrition facts label is the only piece of mandatory information that may float to a different panel, provided it is not the bottom of the package. These next two slides list other requirements for various types of foods. The parenthetical cites are the sections in Title 21 Code of Federal Regulations where additional information on these requirements can be found. Certain foods that must be made in accordance with our regulations in order to bear particular statements of identity. Over the last 70 to 80 years, FDA has established about 200 food standards of identity. Some examples of common foods that are standardized foods are listed on this slide. Standards of identity define the food, describe its basic nature, and any essential characteristics that distinguish the food from similar foods. Standards are recipe-based and some set nutritional requirements, but standards are not safety-based. For a product to be named, for example, enriched bread, it has to be fortified with the B vitamins and with iron in the levels specified in the standard of identity for enriched bread. So let's have a pre-quiz this time. Which of the following can be used to describe a standard of identity? Again, I'll give you a few moments to look this list over, and then we'll come back and discuss it. A food which is represented to be a food for which a standard of identity exists must comply with the specifications of the standard in every respect. You cannot make a product that adheres to a standard for mozzarella cheese, and instead of naming it mozzarella cheese on the principal display panel, you name it Jose's cheese. Okay, we're still getting survey responses, and over 80% of you have said the correct answer is F, which is correct. B, C, and D are statements that can describe a standard of identity. Very good. Let's talk a little bit about modified standardized foods. Standardized foods may be modified, for example, reformulated to be low fat or reduced sugar, provided the modification is done in accordance with Title 21, Code of Federal Regulations, Section 130.10. This section allows standardized foods to be changed to meet the requirements of defined nutrient content claims. Modified standardized foods should function in the same manner that its core standard does. That may require the manufacturer to add certain types of ingredients that are only permitted by 21 CFR 130.10 and are used to ensure that the foods function the same as the core standard. Many ingredients may be used to modify a food that conforms to a standard and a nutrient content claim. When an ingredient is present in the modified standardized food but not permitted in the core or parent standard, the ingredient list must have an asterisk following the name of the ingredient and describing to the consumer that that ingredient is not in the traditional standardized food. I have listed a few websites for additional information on general labeling. We also have a food labeling guide that is in English and translated into several other languages available on our website. Additional information websites include a link to the Code of Federal Regulations, which has more information on all of the areas that I've discussed this morning, as well as allergen labeling. So feel free to visit any of those websites for additional information. Thank you, and are there any questions at this time?
Thank you very much, Felicia. We have several questions that came. Actually, the questions started shortly after you started to speak, and if I can find those questions first, we'll take them in the order that they were received. The first question is, does the BPA that migrates to canned foods fit this category? Oh, I lost it. Wait a second. There are more coming in. But you can, okay, does it fit this category even though it may pose a health hazard?
Substances like BPA and other food additive ingredients are regulated by our Office of Food Additive Safety. And in their review of determining whether a food can be used in making finished foods, they will look at issues like the safety. If there are concerns about the safety of a particular ingredient, there may be additional requirements specific to that ingredient. An example that comes to mind is aspartame. If aspartame is used in a food product, that food is required to have additional labeling to alert persons that have phenylketonuria. So where you have specific types of food additives, either direct or indirect, they've been reviewed specifically for their use, for foods they can be used in, and the Office of Food Additive Safety will determine if there are labeling requirements that must be associated with them.
Thank you. And moving on to the next question, can 1% and 2% milk be declared as quote unquote milk? Oh gosh, it moves. Where is it? It's gone. On the ingredients label.
In the ingredient statement, the only forms of a product that can be simply declared as milk would be those that I've listed on this slide. The only difference in those particular foods is the amount of water that has been removed. But you could have a reduced fat milk, a reduced fat concentrated milk, a reduced fat dry milk. In that case, those three ingredients, with the exception being that the amount of water is different, those could be declared in the ingredient statement as reduced fat milk or low fat milk, whichever case applied.
Here's another question. Thank you very much. Here's another question, and I think you just answered it with regard to water. What about the water added to flour to make a dough and water is driven off in the baking process? According to the speaker, the water is required to be labeled as part of the recipe formulation.
We do have some very specific exceptions for water in certain cases. If you look in the CFR, 21 CFR Part 101.4, where it discusses these other exceptions for ingredient labeling, you may find some exceptions in there for specific cases where water may not be declared. But also keep in mind, if you're making a bread, the bread is going to list the ingredients such as wheat or flour, let's say, and would not specifically always list dough. If dough is listed, the sub-ingredients in dough would need to be declared.
And here's another question. Can there be more than one information panel? Keeping in mind that these questions came in as you were speaking about the information panel. So I'll give you a chance to respond to that.
I would say typically you wouldn't find more than one information panel, but there is nothing to prohibit or prevent a manufacturer from having a package that has two principal display panels and two information panels. It's more common to find two principal display panels. Manufacturers tend to want to use the other information or the other panels on their product for voluntary information, for marketing information, for information about other products that may be in that particular product line. But yes, if a manufacturer wanted to have two principal display panels and two information panels, or one principal display panel and two information panels, there's nothing to prohibit that. But both would have to be correct and in accordance with our regulations.
All right, thank you. We have time for just one more question. And this question is, before we move on to the next speaker, and this question is there a good reference source listing all foods with a standard of identity?
Yes, in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Sections 131 through 169 list all of the foods that must conform to a standard of identity under FDA's jurisdiction. Now keep in mind, for meat and poultry products, you'd need to look at what USDA requires. They also have some standards of identity, but not as many as we do. But if you refer to the regulations, and you do have a link to the Code of Federal Regulations in the slide set, you can find all of the foods that we have standards of identity for.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Billingslea.